All right, hi guys. So Allison Williams and Katie Parker and I are going to be talking about chapters 11 and 13 from the McCoy and Keene book. And Katie and I are going to talk about chapter 11 to begin with, and that is the legal system, and then we'll transition, and Allison is going to talk a little bit about sort of preventative measures for child abuse. So we're going to start out with talking about the legal system, and as sort of an introduction to this, I wanted to return to like when thinking back on when we had a lawyer come and talk to us and how a lot of that like legal jargon is hard for us to even understand as adults, as a way of putting you in a mindset of how this feels for children. And this is what sort of the beginning of the chapter for 11 focused on, this idea that like the U.S. court system is really not set up to meet the needs of children. And when we think about how scary it would be for us as adults to go into a courtroom, we just have to magnify that when we're thinking about kids going into a courtroom, especially when they're coming off of like a traumatic experience such as child abuse. It's just really important that we understand sort of the psychological implications of what's going on with kids there. Um, and one of the biggest reasons that the court system is really not set up for the needs of children is that it's an adversarial system. So that means you have cross examinations, and then a judge is deciding what they think is like the ultimate truth at the end. And something that would be better would be an inquisitorial system where there are two sides that are presenting evidence, and the judge, or excuse me, the judge is like going around and looking and trying to put piece together and find evidence to figure out the truth, rather than pitting one side against another. Because being aggressively challenged by adults is a very overwhelming experience for students, especially and kids, especially when, as Katie will talk about, that often involves parents or loved ones, and that complicates everything even further. So there's a few ways that Press is trying to sort of combat this difficulty, and make courts a little more friendly, I guess, for children. And that is things such as court prep groups. So there's one that's designed by the National Children's Advocacy Center, in which you have 6 group sessions that are led by various professionals, so psychologists or lawyers, people that are going to be familiar or more familiar with the court system. And they take children that are working within the legal or being tried or are on trial, and they take them and help them to feel more comfortable by giving them information sessions, taking them on tours of what the courthouse actually looks like, doing some role play, so they're the judge, and they're trying to figure out what roles these adults actually play and what it means to be in the court system. Because for a lot of kids, the only interaction that they have with the legal system and the court system is maybe from like TV or something that they're seeing elsewhere, and those things are really scary and frightening and unfamiliar to them. And there's so much sort of like change and unfamiliar
Beautiful thing.
things that are going on with kids when they're in the court system, that trying to make it as like familiar and comfortable as possible is really essential. Um, and then there's similar programs like in Canada. They have one that's run by the Child Victim and Witness Program, and it's similar, but it's different in that it has professionals go to children's homes and work with families and children on more of an individual basis, rather than sort of the group sessions the way that they do it in the U.S., which has kids that are going through this sort of a like-minded experience. They take them in together and tour them around the courts and give them these information sessions, so they have sort of peers that they're working with, and it's not quite so alone and individual. So there's ways that we're sort of combating this scariness and this unfamiliar setting that children are exposed to when they're put in the legal system and they're dealing with child abuse cases. But obviously, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, and this is not in any way a perfect system. And Katie is going to talk a little bit more about specifically what those different kinds of cases look like and how children are, the different kinds of experiences they may have when they're dealing with the legal system in terms of child abuse cases.
Great. So I'll jump right in. And Maria and Zena, if you have any questions as we go along, feel free to chime in as we go. And was there sounds a minute ago that everybody else was hearing?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was like part of a commercial or something.
Yeah. I don't know where it was, but we can all mute our microphones. If you hover over the window, like the screen, there'd be at the top of the person that's talking. You can mute that when you're not talking. I don't know if that'll help or not, but we can try it. So a lot of what I'm going to do is talk about the graphic organizer that I put on the Google Drive, so you can pull that up and follow along if you want. And Allison, since you're recording it, maybe you can follow along so that that's on the recorded version. Okay, so like Natalie said, I'm going to be talking about the 4 types of courts where allegations of child abuse might be heard. And as you can see along the top of the graphic organizer thing, there's the juvenile court, the domestic relations court, criminal courts, and civil courts. So I'll talk about each of those a little bit. And I'm not going to cover everything that's there, but I'll try to cover the main things that are relevant for child abuse and neglect specifically. So the juvenile court has 3 types of cases that it works on: juvenile delinquency cases, status offenses, and then the one that's relevant for child abuse and neglect is a type of case called a dependency case. And that's where a court is going to decide if the welfare needs of a child are met by that child's guardians or parents. And in that case, the charges against those guardians would be brought on by CPS. And the court in that case would decide things such as the placement of the child, a treatment plan for the parent or guardian, and a visitation plan for the child. So the experience of the child in that case is that they might be removed from their home. They might live with relatives that aren't their parents or their primary caretaker who was their primary caretaker in the past. They might live with the state, and their parents might be on a treatment plan, which might include things such as parenting classes, drug and alcohol treatment, money for childcare, or like securing employment and finding a place for the child to be or to raise the child. So there are some other notes about that, but I think the main takeaway is just that this is one of the experiences that that a student that we would have or students we would have might have in the legal system in terms of child abuse and neglect. There are other interesting notes about like what the experience of a young person might be in juvenile courts in terms of delinquency and status offenses too, but I'm not going to go into it during that like out loud presentation. So the second type of court where cases of child abuse and neglect are heard is the domestic relations court. And that type of court sees things such as divorce, child custody, and child support. The charges in that case are not brought on by CPS, they're brought on by a parent, or I think presumably like a different family member, against like a person who's supposedly a perpetrator. And then the decisions by the court in that situation are like in terms of who will have custody of the child and what a visitation plan will be, and the court is supposed to make a decision based on what is the best interest of the child. So in that situation, the experience of the child might include undergoing several different psychological evaluations. They are perhaps not going to have an attorney of their own. They may be asked to testify in the presence of both parents and or to say like which parent they prefer to live with, which can be really hard for, I guess, obvious reasons. And then as Natalie was explaining, like the court system can be a really tough experience for a young person. Like it can be for adults and even more so for a young person. And in this specific situation, like the judges might not have any training in child development at all. So it might be a really tough experience for a traumatized child to talk to a judge in this situation. Again, there are other notes about that you can read if you'd like. And then the third type of court where child abuse and child neglect cases are heard is a criminal court. And if such a case is in criminal court, it usually or always is a really severe case of physical abuse that's resulted in either permanent harm or death of the child, or a case of sexual abuse, or a case of severe neglect, again, something that's resulted in permanent harm or death. And then charges in that situation are brought on by CPS or the police, either of those parties, and the court can decide to put the perpetrator, if convicted, in jail, or even something as severe as the death penalty. So in that situation, the experience of the child might be that they have some accommodations in order to testify, but it can actually lead to a mistrial sometimes if a child is accommodated in a specific way, because it might be that the defendant's rights aren't protected the way that rights are supposed to be protected according to the Constitution. Another part of the experience of the child may be that they feel responsible for the family member, for a family member going to jail, if that's what happens. And then another situation might be that it could be re-traumatizing to a survivor if the defendant pleads guilty to a less version of what actually happened to them in their experience. So those are some possibilities for the experience of a child. And then there's some really serious critiques of using criminal courts to prosecute child abuse and neglect, and some of those are, if you look under the other notes section, some of those are that it doesn't actually address the underlying cause to put perpetrators in jail or to have them have the death penalty. It can also divide families, like not specifically the perpetrator from the survivor, but like the rest of the family might have to choose sides, and that sometimes can happen, and that can be tough for everyone. It's like a very divisive experience rather than a healing experience, perhaps. And then it can also be tough for the kid if they feel guilty about putting a family member in jail from their perspective. And then some arguments in favor of sort of criminalization of child abuse and neglect are that it makes it a real crime, and it might be a way to protect future victims. So that's some information about that. And then the last type of court where child abuse or child neglect cases are heard is in civil courts, and that's when a private person brings a case against another private person, and they're charging child abuse and neglect. And that's typically when a child becomes an adult, and that's how they choose to bring that to a legal procedure down the road. And it's usually in a civil court because you can't do it in a criminal court after a certain length of time, or you can't do it in another court after a certain length of time. And in that situation, what can happen is that the court will decide to extract money from the person who's found to be a perpetrator. So in terms of the experience of the child or the person who was a child and is now an adult and is a survivor, they might be forced to testify. And then the last thing I think I wanted to highlight about that is that, like in the other notes section toward the bottom, some of the possible defendants in that type of case are a perpetrator themselves, obviously, and then also maybe the state might be another party, like if it's in a foster care situation, I think. A non-abusive parent, if one of the parents is a perpetrator and somebody else is observing that that's happening but not doing anything to protect the welfare of the child, I think that person is liable. And then, as we've talked about in class, professionals such as teachers who are mandatory reporters, if we fail to report abuse, we can have civil cases brought against us. So I think those are the main points I wanted to bring up. Are there any questions or clarifications about those 4 types of courts or the different cases that children experience?
I'm just curious, maybe this is outside of the scope of what you're actually reading about, but I'm curious about what kind of support system we really have in schools for these kids. I mean, it's pretty far outside of the scope and training of a teacher to be able to support a kid who's had to testify against their parents in court, and then the months and months of after effects of that, and changing houses and all that conflict. And it seems to me that there really actually isn't a lot of support in schools for kids who are going through this stuff. Do you know anything about that?
It's not within the scope of the chapters that we've read, at least as far as I know. I think it makes me think back to what Steve talked about the first day in terms of supporting our students growing in their social emotional learning and being able to express their feelings and the different suggestions he made. But other than that, I don't have any immediate ideas. I don't know if anyone else does.
Love the BCU app. As long as there's
the biggest takeaway that we had, like for us, as teachers from this chapter, was supposed to be I mean, one, on the one hand, that this is just understanding that this is like a very complex issue, and that as teachers we need to be aware that yes, the government needs to have a role in protecting children, but what that role should look like exactly is still sort of, I mean, it's a gray area, and it's like not going to be cut and dry, and it's not always going to be, I think, sometimes has the potential to cause harm as well as help. And so just being aware of that and reaching out, I think in terms of your question, Zena, like reaching out to counselors and to school psychologists and whoever we can.
Allison's recording and she's gone, so.
Oh.
Oh.
Are you back?
We're back.
Okay.
We record.
Sorry, I just didn't want you to keep.
No, that's okay.
Okay.
Basically, yeah, just like I think being aware of that, and then also reiterating what Katie said at the end, especially in terms of like the civil cases, as a reminder that we are mandatory reporters, and so beyond just the obvious like ethical and moral implications of reporting these things, instances of child abuse when we see them, there is also legal repercussions that we could face later on if we don't deal with those problems as we see them come up. So I think those were sort of the big takeaways for us as teachers from this chapter that focused more specifically on just like what those legal cases looked like.
Do you have any ideas, Zena or Maria or Allison, for how to support children, given that we don't know very much about those sorts of experiences in terms of like the huge numbers of experiences in legal proceedings and testifying against parents or whatever it may be?
I guess I feel like, something that I always feel a little bit deficient in working with families is that I need to have a much greater kind of set of community resources to be able to pass along to parents. I think that kids suffer so much because when we're dealing with, so speaking from a little bit of personal experience, when your family is dealing with a legal issue like that you don't have, you can kind of forget to deal with take care of the emotional needs of the kid, or maybe you just don't have the kind of time and energy to really directly deal with what's going on with the kid. And so often they seem like they're fine, and so you allow it to be that way. And I think that parents need so much more support than they really get. And I guess I'm realizing as I'm listening to you talk, like, wow, we really need to have like an arsenal of resources to be able to refer them to. Anyway, community support and mental health resources for kids.
Thanks for that question and sharing those ideas. That's awesome.
And then, yeah, I think that kind of wraps up our chapter 11, and then Allison is going to talk about chapter 13 and sort of some preventative measures.
Mm-hmm. Yes, can everybody hear me? Okay, awesome. Yes, like Natalie said, my chapter is on prevention of child maltreatment. And right off the bat, I'll say that we're not really doing a great job of preventing maltreatment. As you know, we have high numbers of child abuse and neglect in our country, so it is something that we have a lot of room to grow in, right? So I'm going to talk about some prevention programs and strategies and give you some examples, but really the takeaway is what we're doing isn't super effective. And at the end I'll offer maybe a different approach that we could use, recommended by the authors. So, overview of prevention programs for child maltreatment. Generally, they target parents, right? That makes sense, with the exception of child sexual abuse. But prevention programs target parents, and the rationale is that if you're improving parenting skills, increasing their knowledge about normal child development and behavioral expectations, and offering supportive services like counseling or classes, that child maltreatment is likely to not occur if those are all in place. And examples of parent-targeted programs are things like home visitations and counseling, or home visitation services, counseling, support groups, and general education. And like I said, the reality is that our programs actually really aren't super effective. There's a statistic that 1 in 3 parents will abuse their child within 1 year of participation in a therapeutic program. So even when people are having access and utilizing services, many people are likely to continue their behavior in ways. We think of child maltreatment as a public health issue. This kind of started in the 80s. And we think of this for two reasons. Injury, either accidental or intentional, is the leading cause of death for children in the United States. And then we also think of child maltreatment as a public health issue because of the risk factors that arise for victims of child abuse. Those include, or you can be more likely to have alcoholism, heart disease, cancer, or you may be suicidal, maybe, if you are a victim of child abuse or neglect. So it can just affect your health and your well-being later on in life, not just during the time of trauma, like that article we read for Steve. So I can talk about two kinds of prevention approaches. There's primary and secondary. And primary approaches is when you're just targeting the general public. It's basically public awareness campaigns, and that can come in the form of pamphlets or billboards or ads, media, commercials. And that's just targeting the general population, trying to raise awareness on how to report abuse or signs of abuse, what to do if you're a victim. So just general education about child maltreatment. And then, an example would be a parent education campaign, and that can be accessed through the school system or through medical settings. An example of a parent education program or parent education campaign is the Detroit Family Project, and in that there's a parent facilitator, and they go to waiting rooms and medical offices, and they have a cart with information, pamphlets, toys, and snacks, and they just initiate kind of informal conversations with parents in waiting rooms on topics, a variety of topics surrounding parenting, and they reach 25,000 parents a year, so that's just one preventative effort people are making. So, like I said, in terms of most of, like when you're trying to prevent, we are trying to prevent physical abuse or neglect, we target the parents, but when it comes to sexual abuse, efforts are focused on the child, and the idea is to give children, starting at preschool age and then up into their school age, elementary and secondary or high school, providing them with information about sexual abuse and then giving them skills and the tools to protect themselves or report it if they are victims. And it's a little bit contested because some people think that children shouldn't be given that information or it shouldn't be talked about because just the conversations will be more traumatizing than not having them, or will be too disturbing for the child. But the authors referenced quite a bit of research saying that people have done research that proves that people are going to be better off, or the children are going to be better off at protecting themselves if they have information and have talked about ways to protect themselves. So secondary programs target a specific group of people. That could be what we call at-risk populations, which sometimes I don't like that term. At-risk populations, in terms of child maltreatment, can include single parents, parents with a psychiatric history, parents who were abused themselves, and low-income families. And really, what's tricky and difficult about the secondary prevention programs is really trying to figure out who to target. And it's tricky because child maltreatment can be so subjective. There's not really a clear definition, and it's not really this discrete phenomenon where a parent is clearly an abuser or clearly neglecting their child. Oftentimes, parents who are exhibiting these behaviors lie on a continuum where they are strong parents in other areas, and then so you're not necessarily an abuser across the board, which I thought was interesting to think about. That you can exhibit a lot of great parenting, but also fall short. And then also it's hard to pinpoint people because there's not a clear source of child maltreatment or people who are abusing or neglecting their child, right? We don't really, there's not one definitive source for that. So really it's tricky to decide who to target our programs, with our programs. Some specific programs that have been successful at one point in time that I'm going to talk about are related to home visitation programs. And that's where, in the case of a program called Hawaii Healthy Start, that started in the mid-'80s, and a paraprofessional would go into the home of a mother who was at risk for abusing their child within the first year of its life. And so they would work with the mother starting during pregnancy, I think the 3rd trimester, and then provide services, maybe weekly visitation to the home up until the child's 3rd year of life. And that kind of caught on the 80s, and then in the mid-90s that spread to, I think there was like 38 states that had programs like this throughout the 90s. And they were successful at the beginning, and then lately they've come under fire for not being successful, really not producing results, with the exception of a program called Nurse Home Visitation. And as you can imagine, instead of a paraprofessional, a nurse works closely or supports a mother starting early on in her pregnancy, and then is involved with home visitations and other services for the first 2 years of the child's life, I believe. And what the authors made note of is that it's maybe not necessarily true that the reason why these programs with the paraprofessionals aren't as successful as they once were might be because the paraprofessional doesn't have the know-how, or that just might not be the most appropriate or the most well-equipped person to be entering homes of folks who are at risk, versus they made note that the nurses' home visitation programs have more success. So they brought that up as kind of a question to think about, but really the take-home was that home visitation programs can work, and people do benefit from having a support person there, starting with pregnancy and then throughout the early years of their child's life. And when I think about that, I think I can see how it's successful. I also can, I also think about who's going into whose home and telling them what's best, but that's another conversation. Prevention targeting child neglect is something that we have the least amount of programs focusing on, and child neglect is actually the most often reported form of child maltreatment. So that's interesting. People are reporting that the most, but we have the least amount of support for that, or the least targeted support and services for that. Then I just want to conclude by sharing what the author shared at the end of the chapter, which is to maybe think about, when we think about prevention, really actually thinking about like a truly preventative approach to child maltreatment instead of this intervention approach, which is basically what we have in, that's most of the services we offer, is more of an intervention approach. And just thinking about families developmentally, that everybody, all families need some degree of support, no matter if you're predestined to be a child abuser or neglector, and that generally in our society we don't really take preventative measures in general, even in the medical field, but also they use the example of we're just kind of reactionary to our problems. Like we don't take our cars in for checkups, or we tackle a problem after it arises. So just thinking about better ways to just support the general population from the beginning of parenthood. And that is all I have to share. Do you ladies have any questions?
Yeah, do you mind mentioning again how these secondary criteria for the secondary population?
Can you say that one more time?
What's the criteria for the secondary population that supplies targeted support for?
It depends on the program, but really secondary programs target at-risk. So you're asking who is at risk for being a child or reflector, if that's even a politically.
I have a question about, or maybe it's more of a comment. I'm thinking about if you know how frequently there are there statistics about how often parents abuse children because they don't have other effective discipline tools, like because maybe they believe that what they're doing is effective discipline, that it's the only tool they have.
Sorry, Zena, it's pretty echoey. Can anybody else hear?
She's asking if there's data about why parents abuse their children, if it's because they don't have other modes of discipline that they're aware of.
Mm-hmm. I think that's probably like, it wasn't touched on in the chapter, but I think we talked about that in class that a lot of times you continue to do discipline your children the way that you were disciplined, and that you do think that's the most effective way. So prevention measure is to educate parents on different methods of discipline that don't involve moral or psychological.
Yeah. It makes me think that something that we can do as teachers that help prevent child abuse is to help give parents tools, I guess not as much in secondary grades, but to help parents have more tools for discipline and have more access to research, like how thinking is not effective, or just to help them have some tools.
Mm-hmm. Right. I know we talked about slipping that in to the weekly or the monthly newsletter.
I guess I just wanted to say too, I'm sort of wondering what the rates are of child abuse in this country versus other countries that we might be considered similar to in some ways. Like I wonder if it does have to do with like normal violence and privilege systems in this society that lead to child abuse and neglect for a number of different societies like Scandinavian countries or other places have a lesser incidence where there is more equity in terms of socioeconomics and other things. If there's less incidences of neglect, how our history, our country's history of oppression and privilege both play into our experiences of child abuse and neglect. I'm just wondering about that.
Are you asking me a question?
No, I'm just saying something I wanted to say. If anybody wants to talk about that.
I hope I'll remember that when we're presenting, because it connects to a theory about why child sexual happens. What you're talking about systems as far as relating to systems of strain, the systems and strain theory about people abusing because of the incredible strain that they experience in a system where they're completely disempowered.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that might be a good segue too, because I think unless you guys have other questions, that kind of concludes our portion.
Awesome. Okay.
Yay!
So I'm going to say that since I'm the one recording, if it continues to be echoey, maybe I'm going to stop the broadcast and then restart it.
Yes, it's very.
I can barely understand you guys.
Yeah, it's pretty bad on our.
Why don't I stop the broadcast and restart it?
Yes.
Yes.
Hand signals.